Welcome to the Ruby Rogues. My name is John Epperson, and on our panel today we have Luke Stutters.
Hello.
And for our guest today, we have Richard Feldman. Richard.
Hello.
Richard, we've had you on the panel before. I was not here. I was listening to the podcast at this time. It was quite a while ago. I believe Avdi was still on. I don't remember who else would have been there. Looks like, according to the picks, Chuck and Evan, Jessica Kerr at the time. I actually don't remember how to pronounce her last name.
Kerr.
It was Kerr. Okay. Oh, Coraline was on here too.
Jessica and I used to work together, and as I recall, it's a long time ago, I think she introduced herself to me as Care like Care Bear. So I think that's how it's pronounced, but she'll correct me.
I remember that now that I think about it. I remember hearing that. Okay, fair enough. Wow, can't believe I didn't even recognize that. Sorry, Jessica. Yeah, so welcome again. And I remember listening to this particular podcast, actually. I remember being very excited about Elm, and Elm is one of the many things over the years that I was like, I'm going to do that thing, and I didn't do it. So I'm excited to hear how it's changed and different. It also sounds like you did release a book, so we can talk about that too.
Hey folks, if you love this podcast and would like to support the show, or if you wish you could listen without the sponsorship messages, then you're in luck. We're setting up new premium podcast feeds where you can get all of the episodes released after Christmas 2020 without the ads. Signing up will help us pay for editing and production, and you can go sign up at devchat.tv/premium.
I guess maybe to get us into this, why don't you talk about what the goal of your book was, and like, why did you release it? Why'd you write it?
Yeah, sure. So the main goal of the book is to help people who have never done anything with Elm or anything with functional programming of any sort learn Elm from scratch and basically be able to build applications in Elm. One of my big goals for writing the book is that when I was first getting into like functional programming languages, especially typed functional programming languages, I found that a lot of the books, actually really all the books I could find at the time, were just really, really theory focused. They would talk about a lot about like philosophy, and they use the phrase reason about a lot. And I just don't work that way. I like to build stuff. And so I wanted to write a book for people who like to build stuff like me. So that's what the book is. It's a way to learn Elm by building stuff. So over the course of the book, starting from chapter 2, like chapter 1 is basically like syntax and stuff like that, kind of stuff you need. Starting from chapter 2, for the rest of the book, you're working on building a sort of a photo browsing application. And each chapter, it's like you get a new feature to build from your fictitious manager, and you build it. And then over the course of the chapter, while you're building it, you learn some new concept in the language, like testing or, something like that.
It sounds very Rails-esque, right? Like do your iterative thing, get your small victory, move on to the next step.
Could be. Yeah, it's definitely like, it was a real challenge to write the book in that style. I at first I was like, man, why doesn't everybody write a book like this? And by the end I was like, oh, now I know. Because it turns out to be a big challenge to get everything to sort of pull together in that way. Because it's not just that you're like, of course I need to build the application myself so that I can, go back and build it up chapter by chapter. But then whenever I would discover, oh, wait a minute, I need to teach this concept a little bit earlier or a little bit later, then I'd have to go revise the application and then also go sort of propagate that change through all the chapters that were affected. So revisions took a lot longer than I was hoping for up front.
Totally fair. That makes a lot of sense.
But I'm really happy with how it turned out. I mean, it ends up, you do actually build an application from start to finish and learn about the language along the way.
So how do you recommend using Elm? Do you see Elm as a thing that lives alongside Rails in our stack? Is it really a separate thing that we should pick this tool off the shelf when we're approaching certain kinds of problems and leave Rails, for the instead? Or how do you see these things living?
Yeah, great question. So, I mean, the way that we use it at work, like very specifically, is we have Rails on the back end for most of our back end at this point. And then on each individual page, what we do is instead of loading some compiled JavaScript, we load some compiled Elm instead. So basically, anytime you're doing what I would call a web application, whether that's a single page app or just something that has a lot of complicated front end logic, I think that's where Elm's a really good fit. Conversely, if you have just kind of a tiny little bit of JavaScript that's just kind of like augmenting what's primarily HTML on the page, I don't think it's worth it to go like all the way to Elm. You're not really going to get the benefit of using a whole different language unless you have a lot of complexity there.
All right. So we can throw away our React and things like that in exchange for Elm.
That's what we did at work. Yeah. So literally,
right.
we started from React and then migrated things to Elm eventually. I guess it's more accurate to say that Elm took over. Technically, we still have some ancient React in there. It's like React 0.12, I think, because we just haven't. It's been that long since we wrote any new React code.
That's fair. Yeah, I was it like Duff. I don't know. Whatever. Somewhere in there, React changed, and then I went from being very excited about it to not being as big of a fan. So how do you feel about this? All right. So stimulus is kind of a thing in the Rails community right now, and with a good amount of popularity. I don't know. I don't know how popular it is. I like it, but how does it compare with things like that? How do you pick, or are you just committed to Elm, and so you really haven't put a ton of comparative time in? I guess.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I mean, we've been so happy with Elm that we definitely have not really like reconsidered that choice. The way that I see it is, it's kind of like the big question is sort of Elm versus JavaScript as a whole, because they're very different languages. I mean, they both sort of solve the same problem, but they come at it from pretty different angles. And so, from our perspective, like we have a lot of people who are just really happy being Elm programmers. And something that I've noticed is that once people get a taste of using Elm at work, it's pretty common that like the first place they go after, when they're looking to move jobs is like the jobs channel on Elm Slack because they want to use Elm again rather than going back to JavaScript or TypeScript or that whole ecosystem.
I got some dumb questions.
Fire away.
I got some dumb questions.
I got some dumb answers.
Ruby infamously has little to no typing and an amazing imagination. What is it about front end development that seems to require some kind of typing system?
I don't know that it's necessarily so much of a domain specific thing. For me personally, I would say it's more about sort of the identity of the language itself. So you can classify both Ruby and JavaScript as, dynamic languages, but they feel very different to use. I mean, they go about it in very different ways. And similarly, I would say that like Elm and TypeScript, although they're both type checked languages, they feel very different to use and they go about it in very different ways. So I don't know that it's necessarily a front end specific thing. So Evan, who was on the podcast last time, he's the guy who created Elm. And he basically, when he was when he created the language, it was because he had this experience where he was doing an internship at Google, and he was working on like C++ on Gmail or something like that. And a friend of his was doing some JavaScript stuff, and he'd finished his project early and was going over to help out his friend. And he was really surprised by just how hard it seemed to be to work in that environment relative to kind of what he assumed it would be like at a place like Google, where they just have the most investment ever in JavaScript. And what he remembered was he was like, man, I worked with some of these older languages in college, like these ML family languages that have these nice module systems and things like this and that. And it seemed like a lot of this stuff was just much easier. So his thinking was not, oh, let's add a type checker to this. Because I think if he'd done that, he would have ended up with something more similar to TypeScript or Flow or, one of these other projects. But rather, he was thinking about at the language level, I've had these really positive, nice experiences with this other family of languages that are, not as popular in mainstream use. And it's like, I think there'd be an opportunity to try this out in this domain. So whether that's innate to front end or not, I don't know. But I think it really has more to do with like the positive feelings that people express about Elm, I think are similar to the positive feelings people express about Ruby. It's just like a joy to use. It's a delight to use the language.
That's a very positive and uplifting story. I'm going to suggest that the reality is that the web is getting worse instead of better. Browsers are coming left, right, and center. Obviously, IE's going away, but still a lot of things require IE 11 for commercial reasons.
True.
And the front end is inherently a hostile. It's like a Wild West atmosphere. When I'm safe on my server with my Ruby micro frameworks or Rails, no one can touch me. I control the environment. It seems to me that on the front end, you are on the front lines. Front end development is front line development. There we go. You heard it here first. And what I think, reading through and listening to Evan talk about Elm is like a shield that can protect you against the vagaries of what can be really quite a hostile programming environment. on the front end. And let me delve into some of my own front end experiences. Recently,
Sure.
I had to start writing complicated front ends. This
Mhm.
is not something I've done. Generally, I've been writing very simple front ends with a business logic in the back. And maybe you just have to hit a button, or you can do everything as separate pages is fine. But, as it turns out, I do have to write some fairly complicated, almost desktop app-like interfaces now.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
And I looked at Stimulus, but I've been using Vue to do my front-end development. And I get errors left, right, and center. I get more errors from Vue than I have from any other language, any other programming environment. It really, really likes to blow up, and it's very much a sudden death situation. One error in my Vue code will take out the whole page. So I would be very interested, in a front end where I don't have that concern that the app's going to blow up for someone on some browser, and then they're just dead. The single page app stops working, and I've lost that business.
Yeah, I mean, we were using Elm with Internet Explorer 9 for many years, so that's certainly not a concern. And also, I mean, if an Elm app's going to blow up, it's going to be you get a compile error. We actually went almost 2 years before we got our first runtime error that was logged, like our production server logged a runtime exception. It's just, I mean, it can happen. Actually, the particular one that we ran into then was then fixed in the next release of Elm, so that couldn't happen anymore. But that's really kind of Elm's goal, is that if something bad's going to happen, it's going to happen on your local development machine at compile time, not at runtime where it can affect your users. And it really delivers on that. We still have like JavaScript logging, enabled on production, and yeah, the number of runtime exceptions we get from our JavaScript, we still have some legacy JS, even though now we have like 400,000 lines of Elm code. This is at No Red Ink, by the way, where we make stuff for software for English teachers. So students and teachers, we have like millions of users, very high traffic, lots of different devices. By the way, we're hiring full stack engineers and also SRE and tooling engineers if you're interested in working with Elm at work. That's noredink.com/jobs. But I mean, what we've seen over the years, and we've been using Elm since 2015. Actually, I think on that podcast, we were relatively new to using it at the time. But now we've had a lot of experience under our belts. We're way past the honeymoon phase, and we still love it. And part of the reason is just, I mean, we get to see every day in our error reports, on Bugsnag, just how many exceptions our JavaScript code from 2014 is still throwing that we haven't gone back and deleted or rewritten in Elm. And our Elm code just is just plowing along, doing well. Yeah, it feels kind of surreal almost, to be honest. I never thought that, like, prior to using Elm, that was something you could get in the browser, because I mean, as you said, it's a bit of it can feel like a hostile environment in some ways, especially to doing really complex things, because let's face it, that's not what JavaScript was designed for. It was designed for really small scripts. And the way that we use it is to basically build desktop applications that have to be streamed over the internet and used, immediately. Not what it was designed for. But yeah, Elm does do a really good job of presenting something that's much nicer than it's a much nicer interface to the browser. It is different. I mean, it would sort of have to be, right? I mean, it would be weird if you could have something that was both familiar and much better. At some point, in order to be significantly better, you've got to be different. So, hence why there are many of us out there writing things like books and tutorials and things like that to help people learn it.
How is it to get up and running for a Rails developer?
So
how difficult or easy? Good.
Yeah, I think it was since Rails 5 you've been able to use it out the box with sprockets. Don't quote me on that, because we actually have a different build system. We used to use it with sprockets, but now we do our own thing. But yeah, I mean, I guess it's been a long time since I set it up from scratch. So but I believe it should be straightforward.
Fair enough. I mean, I guess wrong person to ask, since you're like, yeah, I've lived with it for forever. I don't even remember what I did.
Yeah. I mean, back when, admittedly, back in 2015, when it was like the early days, it was, you had to do custom stuff to set it up, but I don't believe that's true anymore.
Yeah, I looked up a couple things, and it does look like it works with like Webpacker now and some things. I mean, there's a gem out there to get it started. I don't. Fair enough. I mean, I actually the gem actually now that I'm looking at is no red ink / Elm Rails. So I assume that you guys are involved in that somewhat.
Yep, that's a safe
Okay.
assumption.
Fair enough. So yeah, all right, cool. So I mean, there's some stuff out there you haven't touched in a while, so you don't remember how hard it is, but fair enough. It's cool.
But I do remember specifically hearing that it got easier since we originally set it up. So yeah.
All right, close enough. Sweet.
Can
So
I
why? Oh, go ahead, Luke.
can I ask you about server-side rendering?
Sure. So server-side rendering is a thing that is not supported out the box. It is something that you can get with like a third-party module. That's not something we do at work, but I know that's like a use case that some people care about and have done. I don't know how it integrates with Rails though, because like I said, we don't personally use it at work.
Thank you. It's not people who kind of start in Ruby. They start server-side first. That's what
Sure.
you get. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the transition to a client-side rendered model, which is one I went through when learning Vue,
Right.
was quite drastic. You really
Oh, yeah.
do have to reorganize things and the way you think about it. Do you think of Elm as a client-side framework?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, like I said, I think of it as, if I'm building something complex, I want Elm to help me with that. If I'm building something where the client side interaction is really simple, I just wouldn't bother with any, compiled to JS technology. I probably wouldn't even, bother with a JS framework. I would just write plain old JS, if I'm talking to just a handful of lines here, just to, wire a button up to do something, slightly unusual. That's kind of what JavaScript was originally designed for. And I think it's probably not worth the hassle of doing anything custom at the build level if you know it's going to be really small. But on the other hand, a lot of times it's going to be something really big and complex, and I think that's where Elm shines.
Yeah, I feel like we're kind of like past the stage, right, where we only write small stuff. Literally, I mean, shoot, these small projects that I don't think I'm writing much JS on, suddenly I have 10 JS files, like, and I was just like, this is a simple app. Like, what happened? And it's just the way it works.
Well, I mean, to a counterpoint to that is recently I was writing a documentation generator, and that is something where, I mean, it is almost all static HTML. And I actually tried to have a goal of, I was like, let's see if I can make this work even if someone has JavaScript disabled. And I was able to do it with absolutely everything except for I wanted to have a little search box that would filter things like as you typed into it. So I basically made it so that search box only appears if you have JavaScript enabled, and then everything else. But I mean, all the JavaScript code on that page, fits on one screen. I don't even have to use a scroll bar, right? So yeah, I didn't bother with a build step for that.
Nice. Yeah, and I think one thing that I would throw into the ring is I definitely have gotten a lot of, for the low JS code sites, right? Like I've gotten a ton of work out of Stimulus. So that's been great too. So talk to me about why I should pick Elm. Like what the right use case would be for somebody that's considering it. And maybe a wrong use case if you're aware of that.
I mean, I think the main use case is just you have an application that's, like Luke said, something that's basically a desktop app in the browser. Something that's like going to be pretty complex. So here are some, I don't know, interesting facts about Elm. If you look at JS framework benchmarks and you put Elm into those benchmarks, Elm does extremely well in those benchmarks. Like it's really fast. Generally speaking, outperforms React, outperforms Vue. I think there was like one benchmark where like the latest Angular outperformed it in one of the like micro benchmarks, and all the others Elm was faster than it. So it runs really fast. Also, compiled asset size, it's basically smaller than anything but Svelte. Svelte, I mean, okay, it's hard to beat Svelte because it's like that's their whole point. That's what it was built for. But generally speaking, in terms of compiled asset size, Elm is smaller than everything but Svelte for like real world applications. Yeah, it's just the output that you get is very high quality, and then also the experience of building the application is that it just feels really nice and everything's like works really reliably. One of the biggest things that I think for me that I love about Elm is that the ecosystem is totally separate. like for our front end, except for our legacy JS stuff, we don't use NPM. We just use Elm's package system. And the really critical difference there is that everything in the Elm package ecosystem is 100% Elm. It's just all built on this same set of shared primitives, this sort of different foundational API of how to interact with the browser, which means that we don't get these like, errors sort of sneaking into our system and like, oh, this library had an incompatibility with that library. And one of them was, doing something that it shouldn't have been doing. It's like, no, they all play by the same rules. A way of thinking of this is it's like, well, imagine if JavaScript started with TypeScript in ES6 in 2020 rather than in, the 90s. How much better of an ecosystem would people have made with the benefit of hindsight, and without having to do all these backwards compatibility hacks for old hacks that people used to do previously. And in a lot of ways, Elm is sort of the result of like that, plus sort of going even further and saying, what if we didn't even need to take JavaScript as a language as the foundation? And somewhat miraculously, there actually is an ecosystem there. It's obviously it's not as big as NPM because no ecosystem is as big as NPM. But I mean, if you go to package.elm-lang.org, you can just browse through these packages. There's a ton of packages, and they're all there are nice things like semantic versioning is actually enforced. So what that means is if I go to publish a package and I'm going to actually delete this function, I decided it was a bad idea, I'm going to take it out. If I don't bump the major version number, the package manager will actually reject that. And it'll say, no, that's a breaking change. You have to bump the major version number for breaking change. So, and there are other, things that clearly will break compatibility that it'll do that for. So when I get a package from Elm Package, I know that I'm going to have this really nice upgrading experience. And to be honest, I feel pretty spoiled by that because every time I still use NPM for like some side projects like command line tools and stuff. And whenever I go to upgrade, like immediately, like 5 things break. Like upgrading my packages, I'm just used to things breaking. But in Elm, it's the opposite. Whenever I upgrade my packages, I expect, unless there are major version bumps, in which case, I expect to have to make some changes. If it's all minor and patch versions, I'm just like, yeah, just upgrade. And then I expect everything to just still work perfectly. And that's normally what I get. I mean, of course, bugs can happen. But yeah, I mean, certainly I expect everything to compile again. And that has always been true. It's pretty nice.
It does sound very nice. I think in my experience, Rails sits somewhere in between where most people, most of the time, do a great job. And then occasionally you just get completely surprised and bit. But yeah, so yeah. Okay. So so Elm is faster. It's, smaller. You love your experience in Elm.
The compiler runs faster than TypeScript too.
Fair.
In the experience of people who use both.
What about the F word?
The F word.
The F word.
I only know one F word that you might be referring to, and I'm not sure how it pertains to our technical discussion here.
It's Elm is a functional programming. Yeah. Now this is something I've seen a bit about.
That word's longer than the one I was thinking of.
Yeah, right. I didn't say it was a 4-letter word, but it is the F word. And
that was on my list of things to ask, and I didn't recognize that. Yeah. Go ahead.
Back in the day, Hacker News was full of stuff on Haskell, and it just used to make me angry and confused. And I genuinely believe that Haskell has probably set functional programming back 20 years.
You might be right about that. To be honest,
you use
I think
Ruby.
that's a
don't at me.
Well, I mean, that's a controversial statement to make in the functional programming community, but I think I could be more nuanced about it than that. Which is
let me just say that I feel put off by the fact that it says it's functional. This fills me with fear to see to see the F word in a language. I know I'm wrong. I believe that Elm does provide a superior development experience, and like you said, if it didn't, people wouldn't be applying for jobs doing it. So I totally believe you.
Well, check it out. Go to elm-lang.org and you'll see that it doesn't self-describe as a functional language. It uses a different word.
What's the word?
A delightful language.
Because
that's what it's about, right?
That does sound a lot friendlier than a functional language.
And like, yes, technically, if you go to Wikipedia, it's classified as a functional language, but that's really not as big a part of Elm's identity as being a language that's really user-friendly. It's really I think just because, the languages that Evan used were functional languages, that he said, hey, that I had a better experience in college using these sort of more obscure languages. I want to try and bring something like that, to the modern world. But I think it's more about the legacy than about trying to advance a particular like agenda or viewpoint. And just finding that, Evan tried to put together a language, and I think he really succeeded, that it just has a lot of really nice characteristics. And a functional language is how he ended up there. But I completely understand where you're coming from. I have felt this too. When I was early on, I had a friend who was really into functional programming and who sort of would talk to me at lunch about it and really convinced me that it was worth my while to look into. But man, when I go on Hacker News, when I started like watching some talks, yeah, some of them were really nice, but also some of them just felt like I just felt very inadequate. Like this was like some club that I didn't belong to. And if I'm being honest, part of the way that I wrote Elm in Action was in reaction to that. Like I don't think that it should be that way. I think functional programming languages are languages just like, other paradigms, and they should, sort of stand and fall on their own merits, not because people are talking about them as like, I mentioned earlier, like the phrase reason about. That one really kind of bothers me because it almost seems by implication that like other languages or other paradigms are unreasonable. And I think there's plenty of ways to, criticize and to talk about trade-offs of different languages without all the sort of like high-minded, like, oh, this is just like innately better. I think we can get more specific and say, like, for example, like Elm programs, tend not to crash. That's just like a very concrete, nice thing that we can agree is, a positive thing. I don't think we need to say like Elm programs are easier to reason about and, are more elegant or something like that. I think it's the way that functional programming languages, and in particular, I think, like you said, Haskell, I think historically, the way that Haskell's been talked about in Hacker News and elsewhere, a lot of the time is not really doing the people who like to use these languages any favors.
What's the Elm community like in 2020? You touched briefly on how to get a job in Elm. Where do things happen, and how does it feel to be part of the Elm community?
Great question. So I would say the two main places that people hang out would be on Elm Discourse and on Elm Slack. So I can, if you remind me, I can put some links in the show notes to those. But yeah, so Discourse is for sort of more long form discussions. Slack is for more real time discussions. I generally recommend to people to start off with Elm Slack because the beginners channel there is just full of really friendly, helpful people who will just answer questions in real time. Honestly, it's the friendliest community I've ever been a part of. And I say that with affection for the Ruby community, but I don't know, maybe it's just the Elm community just has a special place in my heart. But I mean, everybody's just really nice and really friendly. And I don't know, I just have a lot of friends there and just think very fondly of it. When I think about what I recommend to people in terms of getting into the community, I always say Elm Slack. And then the next place I mention is Discourse. But that's not to say that there aren't other places. Like I know there's an Elm subreddit and things like that. But I think those are kind of the two main places. Pre-pandemic, a really big place. So we had an increasing number of Elm conferences. So I think back in 2015, we had 0 Elm conferences. In 2019, we'd gotten all the way up to 4 different Elm conferences. And there was going to be an Elm Japan for the first time in 2020, which unfortunately had to be called off along with all the other 2020 Elm conferences. So hopefully, knock on wood, those will be coming back after the world gets back to normal. But I really miss it. I just have a lot of great memories of just getting to meet people in person and, exchange ideas and yeah.
Awesome.
Have you ever wondered if you could be offering a faster, less buggy experience for your customers? I mean, let's face it, the only way you're going to know that is by actually running it on production. So go figure it out, right? You run it on production, but you need something plugged in so that you can find out where those issues are, where it's slowing down, where it's having bugs. You need something like that there. And Raygun is awesome at this. They just added the performance monitoring, which is really slick, and it works like a breeze. I love it. I love it. It's like you get the ray gun and you zap the bugs. Anyway, definitely go check it out. It's going to save you a ton of time, a ton of money, a ton of sanity. I mean, let's face it. Grepping through logs is no fun, and having people not able to tell you that it's too slow because they got sidetracked into Twitter is also not fun. So go check out Raygun. They are definitely going to help you out. there are thousands of customer-centric, customer-focused software companies who use Raygun every day to deliver great experiences for their customers. And if you go to Raygun and you use our link, you can get a 14-day free trial. So you can go check that out at rubyrogues.com/Raygun.
Yeah, I think not necessarily to rehash functional stuff per se, but I mean, I think one of the you talked about like nice communities, right? Or we were kind of talking about nice communities, and you're like, well, I love Elm even more than I like Ruby's community, right? And I think, I mean, to be frank, there's some sort of thing, right? Nice communities and how you advocate for your language, I think kind of go hand in hand, right? I like Ruby, and I feel like not taking my Ruby Bible, so to speak, and beating people over the head with it, right? Makes people amenable to wanting to join the Ruby community. And I feel like I have never been browbeat by an Elm Bible. So I have a positive opinion of the Elm community, right?
That's
Whereas
great. Yeah.
I have been smacked by the JavaScript and the Haskell 2x4s, quite a lot, right?
Oh no.
So yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Anyway, I'm a big fan of like nice communities. Otherwise, I
think we need more of it in programming. I think that's sort of one of the changes we can be in the world. Like Min Swan is just a great. Matt's is nice, so we are nice. Like I love that. It's just a great like mantra to live by. Like let's try to be nice to each other.
I agree. Though that particular one always bothers me, not because the idea bothers me, but because what happens when Mats dies, or what happens if Mats like,
oh my God.
I don't know, like if something happens to Mats and he's suddenly not nice, like
hey, we look 2020. We've had enough bad news in 2020. All right, we don't.
Right?
Or sure. I'll knock on wood, guys. I'm not trying to suggest that this would happen. It always like worries me. What if? Sorry. But yeah, no, I like nice communities, and I've always like it's part of the reason why for me the Elixir community has always had some sort of draw, right? Like I feel like they've always tried to be like make me feel like they're going to be a nice community if I come join them. So
yeah, I think another interesting thing. So to maybe draw a bit of contrast, but I think they're sort of coming at the like let's have a nice community from different angles. Evan has always said like, hey, let's it's great if you like Elm compared to what you're using before, but let's not bash other languages. Like we can say like, hey, I prefer this, but we don't need to like talk smack about whatever we were using before.
It's too late because I've done it already.
But at the same time, he also says, hey, I don't want to, like, people would ask, like, hey, should we call ourselves Elmists or Elmers or, Arborists, or like what name should we use? And Evan was like, how about just Elm programmers? Because at the end of the day, it's a tool. It's not like we need to sign up for a religion here. It's like, it's okay if you like Elm for this problem, and it's okay if you like other things for other problems. We don't need to, self-identify as like that strongly with this tool that we're using. And I think that sort of reminds me of, it's like the opposite of the thing you were saying earlier about functional programming. Like there are definitely some people I've met for whom it's not just a tool, it's not just a paradigm, it's sort of like a way of life, or like something that needs to be preached, as opposed to just I think there's an important difference between that and saying like, hey, here's this nice thing, or hey, this has nice properties. We can talk about it in sort of a calm way without forming factions. And I think that's also like a step in the right direction towards having nice communities.
Remove the zealotry from it, and it kind of just yeah.
But I mean, obviously, like I'm a very passionate person. I really love Elm, but that's not to say that like I'm not going to claim that Elm will be the best language for all time for every problem. Like there are problems like I just talked about earlier where I choose not to use Elm, and also there are it would be weird if this turned out to be the last programming language anyone ever needed for this domain, right? Like we're technologists, technology evolves. Sooner or later there's going to be something else.
Go on, John.
No, go ahead, Luke. I'll let you.
I was going to say, speaking of evolution, how has the Elm grown in the last 5 years?
That's a great question. It's funny because I think of it as a mixture of growth, but also refinement. And so some things have grown and other things have sort of intentionally shrunk. So actually back in 2015, that was pretty close to a big turning point for the language, which is to date the biggest like breaking change the language has ever had, like by a very large margin, which was basically simplifying the foundational primitives of the language. So originally there used to be this very low level concept called signals, and everything was built out of signals. And at some point, what we discovered was that in practice, everybody tended to organize their signals into this model, view, and update concept. And so you'd have your model, which is like your application state. Then you'd have your view, which was a way to render that state. And then you'd have update, which is a way of transitioning from one state to another based on user input. And those are sort of the three ingredients that everybody would use. And at some point, this became a library. And then eventually it was like, you know what? Why don't we just make this the primitive? Because signals are really hard to learn and everybody uses them in the same way anyway. So basically Evan said, yeah, we're gonna move the foundation and say now the foundation is this sort of model, view, and update API that everyone uses anyway. And that's what it's been ever since. And it was a really nice simplification to the language in my view. And it's sort of almost become synonymous with Elm. It's known as the Elm architecture. And that architecture has since been ported to JavaScript and various libraries. And people seem to like to use it outside the Elm community too. But making it like a first-class thing in the language, I think, was the biggest way that Elm's changed since those days. Other things that have changed. So other things have like simplified and gone away. There have been various API changes. The compiler's gotten a lot faster since it was in those days. Like now it's very fast. I mean, it's normal to have a Scratch compiler usually should only take, so we have like 400,000 lines of code at work. Actually, I haven't measured this in a while, but generally speaking, if you're doing an incremental recompile, you expect it to be under a second or like maybe about a second, depending on what changed and like how many other modules that affects. Obviously, lots of, bug fixes and things like that. But really like the fundamental experience of using Elm, I don't think has changed that much other than just sort of getting better. I would say it's more refinements than anything else. We got a nicer debugger. It does like time travel and stuff like that out the box. And yeah, at this point, I would say the language has gotten quite stable. I don't really anticipate any major breaking changes in the immediate future, which, for a language that's granted, not been around for even a decade yet at this point, it's nice to see that it's sort of starting to be like, okay, this has been vetted. This design is nice. We don't need to like keep making big changes. There were like one or two changes of various sizes that seemed to be necessary based on what we learned. But at this point, it's like, yeah, it seems to be working pretty well for people. One possible thing, which I don't want to promise because it's not clear that this will end up making sense, but you mentioned earlier about desktop applications in the browser.
Yeah.
And so one thing that a lot of people ask me about is WebAssembly. What's the deal with like Elm and WebAssembly? Because Elm compiles to JavaScript. And the short answer there is that Elm is designed to be able to compile to WebAssembly, in fact, in a backwards compatible way where even so one of the things you can do with Elm is JavaScript interop. So we use this at work for like, there's some like rich text like WYSIWYG editor that we use, like little things like that, that's written in JavaScript. And one of the things that Elm is designed to be able to do is in the future to be able to compile to WebAssembly instead of JavaScript and yet still be able to be backwards compatible with not only your existing Elm code, but that even includes your JavaScript interop. This is all like theoretically, by design, but it's not necessarily, going to work out in practice if maybe something surprising happens. But yeah, there's really no reason that like from a design perspective, Elm could not compile to WebAssembly if that turns out to be something that people want. Of course, there are questions of like browser support and things like that, but it's somewhat of an exciting prospect to me that the code that I've already written or like all that, code we have at work could someday just get a really big, nice performance upgrade by having it compiled to WebAssembly instead of JavaScript without our having to really lift a finger. But, that's sort of what you can get when you have a language that's by design sort of compiling to JavaScript as sort of a compilation target exclusively rather than as, sort of like an enhancement on top of JavaScript like TypeScript is.
No, I think WebAssembly had a bit of a tough start in its life, where the first time anyone saw it was when it was mining bitcoins unwelcomely on your computer. So hopefully the future of WebAssembly will be a bit brighter. That was really interesting what you're saying about JavaScript interop. So as a semi-reluctant front-end dabbler, I am the front-end builder of last resort. And I like to take relatively complete JavaScript components to solve a problem which I have a lot of difficulty building. Say, for example, I wanted to build, as you said, a rich text editor, some kind of WYSIWYG tool. I don't want to spend a lot of time doing that if I can just drop one in. And sure, it might take me a couple of days to get it working, but that sure beats 6 months writing one from scratch.
Sure.
So how interoperable is Elm, and do you cover that in your book?
Yes, there's actually a whole chapter on that called Talking to JavaScript. And yeah, so Elm is definitely interoperable with JavaScript, but the way that it does it is pretty clever, in my opinion, where it basically sort of segments the JavaScript off. So there's sort of like Elm land and JavaScript land. And you can get the two worlds to talk to each other. That's why the chapter is called Talking to JavaScript, but it's not a fluid thing. So you can't, for example, in the middle of your Elm function, just call an arbitrary JavaScript function. It's more like, the way I like to think of it is it's somewhat like broadcasting an event. So Elm will say like, hey, JavaScript, I want you to do this thing. And then on the JavaScript side, you have a listener set up that says, oh, I hear that Elm wants me to do this thing. Great. I will do that thing and then broadcast an event back to Elm, and Elm's listening for events from JavaScript. And so in this way, you have a very strong abstraction boundary there. And so you can tell all the things on Elm land follow the rules that you're used to, and all the things in JavaScript land, it's back to the Wild West. But they can talk to each other. So you can, and the end user has no idea this is happening. It's just, from their perspective, it's just a page. The other thing you can do, and I covered both of these techniques in the book, is actually you can use custom elements, which is part of the web component specification. I think that Elm programmers might be, in practice, the biggest users of web components just for interop. Because it turns out to be a very convenient way to do interop with JavaScript stuff. So the way, if you're not familiar with web components, the basic...
I am not familiar with web components.
Okay, so it's a relatively rarely used specification in the browser, but it's basically a way to define a custom element, or at least this is the part of it that we really use. Technically, web components also covers like shadow DOM and things like that, which are not really important for the interop purposes. But custom elements in particular is a pretty straightforward idea for a feature, which is basically, so you've got your built-in HTML elements, like you got button and div and so on and so forth. And custom elements is a way for you to, in JavaScript, define new elements, which whenever they're instantiated in the browser just runs your JavaScript code, no matter how they got into the DOM. So in this way, what you can do is you can start by saying, I want to define a new custom element called, I don't know, WYSIWYG-editor. And whenever I see a tag, whenever the browser sees a tag called WYSIWYG-editor, it's going to run this custom JavaScript code that I have defined to set it up and have it, send events and then tear it down when it's all done. And then on the Elm side, you just say, oh, I would like to put in an element here called WYSIWYG-editor. And I'm going to give it these attributes, these properties, and set up these event handlers on it. And then the browser will actually take care of making the communication happen, because the browser's like, oh, you've added one of these elements. I will go ahead and run my hook for the custom element and so on and so forth. And yeah, in the book, we give examples of doing interop in both of those different styles. The custom element one, of course, is quite nice when you want to have something like right in the middle of your DOM, like, a custom element. And then the other style is more for like, if you want to do some processing, like you want to send it off to like a JavaScript logging library or something like that.
It's my understanding that this is what we're doing when we put custom components on the page with like React, for example.
So React doesn't actually use the web component spec or the custom element spec. They have their own sort of thing behind the scenes. I actually, a few years ago, I went to a conference where one of the days of the conference it was called a Creators Summit. And it was basically representatives from several different communities, like technologies working in the browser. So it was like me from Elm, and Tom Dale from Ember, and Andrew Clark from React, and Stephen Fluent from Angular, and I totally blanking on who was there from Vue, but it was two people. It was Divya and so people from different front-end technologies. And one of the questions that someone asked at one point of the group was like, hey, do any of us really think that we should change our component systems over to use custom elements and like web components, or should we just continue doing our own things? And we all agreed that we should all continue doing our own things. And I mentioned like, hey, by the way, we really like it for interop, but yeah, we still use our own representation internally for for actual rendering. And that everybody has good reasons for doing that. I think that's probably likely the way it's going to stay.
That's an interesting tidbit.
Yeah.
I've been educated.
I have been too, but I've forgotten a lot of it over the years.
Oh, that's totally fair. Okay, so what is the testing land like out there? Like, I mean, is the tooling ecosystem good? Does it have edges? I mean, you already mentioned earlier the time traveling, the debugging, the time traveling debugger that you already have. So,
Yeah. So great question. So for unit testing, there's Elm test. And basically, there isn't really any Elm specific sort of integration test stuff because usually when you're dealing with integration tests, you sort of need to spin up a browser and like actually, like run the code to see what actual DOM elements appear there. If you want to test the sort of a Elm virtual DOM code, you can do that in Elm test itself, and you can actually run queries on your own, like internal, like staying within Elm land virtual DOM, and say like, oh, I expect there to be a button here and a div there, and so forth. But of course, it's always possible that the real browser might do something different if you have certain extensions installed or things like that, or you have other JavaScript on the page that's messing with the DOM. So if you want an integration test, Elm doesn't really have anything special to say there. You can use like Cypress or something like that. But for unit testing, Elm test is kind of, similarly to Elm itself, designed to be really nice, easy to use out the box, and really fast. And I think it does a good job of that. And there's a chapter on that in the book also.
Okay, even better,
Yeah.
even better. I don't. Is there anything that you specifically feel like we maybe haven't touched on yet that you're like, well, we should really talk about this thing?
Oh, that's a good question. No, I think it's been an interesting discussion. I can't think of anything.
Okay.
Where,
you also
where
put in
can
your
I? Sorry, John.
You also put in your notes that you had a interesting story around how you came to be the author of this book.
Oh yeah. So the way I came to be the author of Elm in Action was that, and this is actually in the foreword of the book. So I got an email from Manning saying they were going to do a book about Elm, and they wanted to know, like, I guess I'd given a talk about Elm or something at that point, and I was part of the early Elm community, I guess. And they asked if I wanted to get on a call to talk about, people I might recommend for writing the book. And at this point, I'd co-authored a very early book on React, and I'd written some blog posts, and that was kind of about it, given like a talk or two. And I'd never, written a whole book myself or anything like that. But I got on the call, and I started getting really animated about just explaining about like, well, it's really important that this is a book about building things, and kind of like a reaction to some of the stuff Luke was saying earlier, and trying to make it, like not about this like high-minded stuff, but just about let's just build a thing in a nice programming language. And then I was like, oh, and also you want to make sure to start by teach this first, and then teach that later, and teach this in terms of that, because I'd also been like, had some experience teaching Elm to people at this point. And of course, by the end of the call, I was like, all right, I'll write it, which I suspect was kind of what they were, why they reached out to me to ask me for names in the first place. That may have been the goal, and if so, well played. But I did not intend to write a book about Elm until they reached out to me and asked me for some names of people who might be good to write it, which I also recommended. There are other people who've written Elm books too, but yeah, I thought that was funny. I don't know if maybe other authors have had that similar experience, but it was a first for me.
Where can I go to look at sites made using Elm? So we've got the No Redding site. What other sites are there? You're like, look, Elm can do this.
Oh, good question. I think there's a Built with Elm GitHub repo somewhere, builtwithelm.co. Yeah, looks like they just got a bunch of sites here. Yeah, screenshots and links to various things.
Thank you. I will go and check that out.
Oh, that's what I assumed as well.
Hey, folks, I don't know if you've noticed, but I've been working a lot on figuring out how to help people become the most valuable developers on their teams, or becoming the top 5% of developers in the field. If you're looking to level up, figure out how to contribute more, get the career you want, get the career that you want that will support the lifestyle you want, then you should check out the Most Valuable Dev Summit. I've invited some of my friends across the community, people that you've heard of, people that have worked on systems that you use on a daily basis, people who have invented new ways of doing things over the years in programming, and I've asked them one question, and that question is, how do you become a top 5% developer? How do you become 1 in 20 of the best developers out there? And so we're going to go ahead and have that conversation with them in interviews on the Most Valuable Dev Summit. And you can find that at summit.mostvaluable.dev.
Cool. Then I think we should probably roll into picks, maybe, unless we have something else. Sounds like we don't have anything else. Okay, sweet. Luke, did you want to start us off?
I did. I have been building front ends this week, funnily enough, and I've been using a few components from a guy called Rick, who has a kind of small software business in the Netherlands called Pekina.nl, and it's PQINA.nl. And these are just kind of file upload components and a few really useful things. And I've been using them to upload to Linode's object storage S3 alike storage system, which is my second pick. And I have picked it before, but the object storage component on Linode does not talk to the standard AWS S3 gem in Ruby. And if you start talking to it and following the S3 guide, you will quickly find it is not S3 compatible out of the box. You must add to your Rails setup a magic option. And that magic option is the HTTP continue timeout. And then everything magically starts working. So a qualified pick there for Linode system, it's a lot cheaper than S3. It's a lot cheaper than Google Cloud, but you do need to know the magic option to get it working with Ruby.
Fun fact about them, they're actually headquartered in Philadelphia, which is where I live, and they host meetups at their office, which is actually in a bank. Like they have...
They've got their own bank?
Well, the building used to be a bank. So they actually have like servers down where the vaults used to be. It's pretty cool.
Nice. That's pretty sweet.
Yeah.
All right. So I have a couple of picks today. One is just kind of something that I was encountering this past week. So I was working on a thing recently where, I have my consulting firm or whatever, and we had a client come in that wanted they wanted some customizations to Shopify, and in the end, what they wanted was like Shopify Pro or Plus or whatever it is that costs like a couple grand a month or whatever. So that wasn't really in their budget. And so anyway, long story short, after a really long process of talking about what they wanted and what they, discovering what they needed and things like that, kind of turns out that they just kind of wanted a small thing. And we ended up basically proposing to put together a site or whatever, basically a custom thing for them. It's using Spree, or whatever. So, if you remember from way back or whatever, they're obviously still around, Spree, and whatever the thing that came out of them later. I can't remember off the top of my head.
That's the e-commerce, the kind of Rails e-commerce thing.
Yep. So, it works. It's pretty, and, if you're just trying to spin up more or less e-commerce thing for somebody, and it looks like a monolith and it quacks like a monolith, like Rails with Spree does the trick. So that was pretty cool. Yep. And so then for my second thing, I was looking at my list of stuff, and something that I haven't recommended here that's on my list. So a book series that I read a really long time ago. I don't know what it is, but I've always kind of liked Merlin, the mage, King Arthur kind of era stuff, right? So, if you're familiar with Legends stuff, some of them talk about him in a pretty cool manner, and he's always kind of has, a pretty cool atmosphere to him. But then there's some that, he's got some creepy elements to him, right? But
are we talking about series. Arthur or Merlin here?
Merlin, both actually, but Merlin specifically is who I'm talking about. But there's this book series where basically the author imagines Merlin, how he became Merlin as a kid, basically. And so I'll paste this in here, but it's a really fantastic series or whatever. I remember I read this. It's been a long time now, but it's like, I don't know. I have a handful of 10 to 20 book series that I'm just these are awesome. Everyone should read them, and it's on that list. So it's pretty sweet, and I'll paste it in here in just a second once I actually find a link to it on Amazon. So yeah, that was super cool. I just really liked that it gave him a lot of motivations. And if you think about it, I think one of my favorite things here is, Morgana Le Fay's always like the evil bad guy, right? So, and not a lot of people explain why she's evil and bad. It's oh, she hates Merlin. Why? Because I don't know. So, and yeah, that was one of my favorite parts about it. But Richard, did you have anything maybe?
Yes, I got a couple. Okay, first one, I realize that I'm extremely late to the party here, but Battlestar Galactica, it's good. I never watched it when everybody else watched it, when it was actually a new thing, but it was always kind of on my back burner, oh yeah, I should try that at some point. And yeah, it really holds up. It feels like watching a brand new series that just came out, except that I know it's all the episodes are available miraculously. So if anyone hasn't checked that out, if you like, sci-fi type stuff, definitely recommend it. Second pick, Front End Masters. So I did an Elm course for them as well. So if you like more of a workshop style format, it covers a lot. There's a lot of overlap with the Intro to Elm workshop that I did for them and the book. I also did an advanced Elm workshop for them, which is sort of more for like once you've been into Elm for several months. So if you're interested in either of those, check them out, frontendmasters.com. I'm also doing a Rust workshop for them, which will hopefully be out in April 2021. We will see. So it's still a work in progress, but that's the goal. Third pick is, this is going to be a weird one, barbellmedicine.com. So this is basically two doctors, like MD doctors, medical doctors, are both really into strength training, like lifting heavy weights. And as for health, and then also, I guess some people do it competitively. And I've just gotten really into their stuff. It's like they're really nerdy about it, and they get into all these like details of like protein muscle synthesis and stuff like that. And they have like videos on YouTube and like guides on their website. And I don't know, I've never really been somebody who likes to exercise for its own right, but I definitely like nerding out about things. And so it's been kind of cool to read their stuff, and it's like made me enjoy that aspect of it more.
Awesome. I can totally sympathize with the being late to the game thing. My wife and I, neither one of us had watched any Star Trek our entire lives.
Oh,
and
wow.
A few years ago, we embarked on a journey and watched all of it. So
like every series.
Like we watched everything. So it happened.
Wow.
I totally understand that thing where you get to a thing like really late. It's got it.
Nice.
Cool. Well, thanks. One more thing before we get. Actually, if people want to reach out to you, find out more information, how do they get a hold of you? What's the best way?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter, Elm, Slack, and GitHub as RT Feldman, and yeah, you can find all my Elm projects and stuff there, and my on GitHub. And I not super active on Twitter, but I used to be more active, and then I decided I should be less active on it. But definitely still, I'm on there, and if people at me, I generally respond to things. So
awesome. We can get those links in the show notes as well. Awesome. Thanks for listening, everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks
for coming.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.